Welcome to another episode on the People Productivity Channel, where you are the product and a better you is a solution. Today we have back on a very special guest, Richard Shapiro, founder of the Center for Client Retention. Hey, Richard, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, Frank. How you doing?
I'm doing well too, and so glad during this whole pandemic that you're doing very well. So thank you for taking time to come back on with this very important topic on what people should do to sustain and thrive in difficult times with their business. So this is going to be a really super interview, folks. Richard, maybe you could introduce yourself quickly.
Sure. And by the way, I want to thank you. When you're invited once, it's great, but when you're invited twice, it's marvelous. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Mm-hmm. So once again, my name is Richard Shapiro, and I founded a company called the Center for Client Retention about 32 years ago, and we're still very successful. And one of the reasons why we're successful, by the way, is that we are the Center for Client Retention, so we don't lose clients. We know how to keep them. And what our company does is we teach our clients or educate our clients how to create and build personal relationships. Because if you have a strong personal relationship, while it's not a guarantee that you're going to keep business, it definitely helps. It definitely points you in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So, Frank is probably going to mention, that I have been through several downturns throughout my career, business-wise, and how did I get through those? So,
and that is the substance of today's conversation. Richard and I were chatting, and he was talking about the things he's done to not only maintain his business but do well during difficult times. And you've actually been through a lot. You founded the business shortly after the 1987 crash.
Right, the Black
It was a difficult
Monday.
time. Black
Right.
Monday, yeah. So tell us a little about that. That was a difficult time to get going.
Well, it was a difficult time, but I think the overall theme, beside creating and building relationships, is I always ignored the recessions. I always ignored this pandemic as much as I could ignore it from a business perspective. I think that if you put your head in the sand, every time there's a recession or a downturn, and you just kind of walk around depressed, that's not going to help you. It's not going to help your clients and things like that. And I remember 2008, 2009, we just moved into our, beautiful new offices, and I wanted to have a holiday party. And some people said, well, maybe you shouldn't. But no, I had the most magnificent holiday Christmas party with rose petals spread out through the floor. And I brought in, bica trees with lights. No, the place was gorgeous. And that was just after, everybody knew that there was going to be a major, downturn. So I think you have to be optimistic. Mm-hmm. You also have to have a good product and good service. A lot of what we do are customer satisfaction, customer satisfaction research. And basically, you should be finding out what your customers want during good times and bad times. And I think a lot of companies fail to see that. That's one of the areas that they cut. And if you have some kind of research process in place where you're getting ongoing results, it's so important to just continue that measurement system. I know one of our clients is in the food business, and every time they have a recall, they have a major influx of calls, but they want to know how those calls are being handled. They want to know if their clients are still going to be loyal after that recall. So I think one of the keys is to also have a service that your clients can fight for and that you feel is valuable, to your clients.
So you say customer feedback is key, and obviously that has been proven over time.
No, absolutely. And what we talked about, Frank, even just before we got on, is that historically, if you've been speaking to your customers over the last couple of years or last 6 months or even last 3 months or whatever, you have data to use. But now with the pandemic, this is different than a typical, recession or downturn. Mm-hmm. Every business is brand new. And anytime I'm being interviewed now or asked my opinion by anybody, I say, basically, you have a whole new company. So I don't care if you have 10 customers or you have 1,000 customers, you have 1,000 new customers or 10 new customers, because in many cases, Your customers' lives personally have changed. In many cases, the person that you were dealing with, even if you have Bank of America as a client, if you were an attorney for one of their divisions, that client contact might be gone. So basically, you have to reinvent yourself, you have to reacquaint yourself, and you have to re-onboard that customer. And one of the best ways that I think to do that is to ask your customers questions that are very thoughtful, and I can share some of those questions
We should go through those. Now, you learned some of this at ADP, correct?
Absolutely. You know, at ADP, when I started about age 22, the revenues were like 4 million, and when I left, they were $4 billion. So I did experience a lot of growth, and I had a lot of opportunities there. So I started as an account executive, was in client services management, general manager of ADP's largest region, and specifically in the last position, that's where I learned how to be successful in client retention and increasing market share from existing customers. When I took over this program that was just in this infancy, the National Account Manager Program, I started going out with account managers to see how the program could be more effective. And I realized, number one, they were only seeing users and not seeing decision makers. And decision makers are called decision makers because they make the decisions whether to keep your product or not. Number two, even if they were seeing the decision maker, they weren't asking a decision maker good questions. And even if they were asking the decision maker good questions, they weren't doing anything with the feedback. So I created a tool. Actually, the tool, I like to give an analogy, is like a screwdriver. Like everybody has a screwdriver in their toolbox, but once in a while you're a little bit too lazy. So you might take a nickel or a dime or a penny and try to, turn something rather than trying to find, the toolbox in your closet. Well, the tool in your toolbox are questions. Questions can either be not utilized at all or can be used, very effectively. So I work with our clients to develop specific questions that their clients could ask, but there's certain general questions that any firm could ask because it's really, you're talking to people. So and every business certainly has strategic plans, and they have sales, and they have marketing, and they have operations. But I explained that often the screwdriver, which is in everybody's toolbox, which are really a series of questions, they're not really used enough and properly. So.
And you find that the questions not only allow you to gather information, but to deepen your relationship with those customers, correct?
Absolutely. And that's what I found out at ADP, that as the account managers were asking these questions, and it might only be like a 15 or 20-minute session, I could tell. I was smiling inside. I didn't always smile outside, but I was smiling inside. Number one, this is a fact. Customers or clients will answer almost any question that you ask them. You can't ask the first question, well, how can we get more business from you? No, because but if you're asking a series of questions like, how are you personally? How can I help you with your challenges? What are your challenges? What are your goals? How can we help you help your clients? If you ask them a series of questions like that, at the end of a 10 or 15 or 20-minute dialogue, then you could say, I was curious, do you split up your business among different suppliers? And, what percentage of the business are we getting? And how can we increase? What can we do to increase that? Another great question, especially specifically geared to operations, is to ask things this way, like, has our service and support and how we demonstrate appreciation increased or decreased or stayed the same over a certain period of time? Like during the last year, do you think our service, once again, has improved, stayed the same, or deteriorated? Because even if someone gives you an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10, that doesn't mean that they're happy with that 8, because maybe it used to be a 9, and maybe there was a big difference between 9 and 8. So that's one way. And another way, especially on competition or even any other supplier, is to say, in this particular area, in logistics, are we better, comparable, and not as good? So most of these questions should not be geared specifically to customer satisfaction, but more strategic questions. But still, it's good to include some of those service-related questions, in there.
Yeah, so these questions really allow you to gauge how you're doing versus the competition, which is super.
Right. And you can be cautious. I mean, they might not want to tell you that, like when I first started my business, for instance, all our clients, which we still have some of them, were Japanese office product companies like Canon, Ricoh, Sharp, Toshiba, and they might not if they were like a multi channel dealer or multi manufacturer dealer, maybe they had Canon, Ricoh, Sharp, and Konica. I don't know.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily have to say, "Oh, are we better than Konica?" But you could just say overall, are we better than in these, warranty support, field support, telephone support, and then of course, if they're either better or not as good, you find out why. If it's the same, it wouldn't make sense to say, well, why are we the same? It's the same. But once again, I was always shocked that customers will answer any question, almost any question you pose, if you do it in the right order and they feel you're sincere and you give them time, to answer it. And lastly, too, this information is so great. Let's just say that you have 100 clients and you pick out your top 10 or 15, maybe it's the 80-20 rule, where 20% of your clients give 80% of the business. You could, after you accumulate this data, you can feed this information back to your clients in a newsletter or personally or at an event or a virtual event and say, what, this is what we found out from our clients and this is what we're going to do. Now, you don't have to share everything. Once again, you would share the stuff that made sense. But if there was some big problem, if it was logistics and then you've figured out how you can get product to your suppliers faster, that would be something that you'd want to bring back.
Sure. And the fact that you're listening and taking action immediately creates a little bit more loyalty.
No, it creates a lot more loyalty.
Yeah.
And as I was mentioning a little bit, just quickly, during those downturns, I can't tell you how many times I heard from my clients, my boss came in and he said, let's cut that budget line for, research. And they said, no, we're not cutting it. And they said, we didn't cut it because of Richard Shapiro or the Center for Client Retention. I mean, we didn't fight for it. We fought because it was a valuable service. But in addition, we have a strong relationship we have a strong partnership with you. We have a strong partnership with the company. And we feel that it's important, to continue, that measurement process and continue your services.
And not only did they not cut it, in cases they obviously increased it, right? They wanted to find out even more. So you were experiencing growth during these downturns.
Absolutely.
You had getting new ones, growing, inside sales.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, it's this year, to your point, right now our revenues are probably up about 8 or 9% from last year. And during the 2008, 2009 recession, I remember that my banker came from PNC and he said, Rich, you are the only client I had where the revenues did not, for a service business, where the revenues did not go down 40%. I mean, basically they had stayed the same, he said, which was unbelievably, an accomplishment.
So you said earlier that you've got to go through these questions in a certain order. What do you recommend?
Well, I always like to start with the positives. So I think, well, number one, you have to find out how they're doing personally. I mean, that's their family and things like that. But the second thing is, one of the questions that I always like to ask is, why did you select our firm in the first place? Now, no one is going to pick a firm for a negative reason, okay? So, they might say you were the lowest cost, or you were, logistically or geographically in the area and wanted to, a lot of times you find out things that you don't know. But what's also great about it, if someone says, well, I wasn't here, I didn't make that decision, you can say, well, let me tell you why a lot of our clients, work with us or partner with us. And another really good question to start off with after that is, what does work well? What do we excel at? And then go into some of the other, questions, but always start off with a positive. First of all, that gives you great information, because maybe in those first two questions, they're going to tell you, you know what, your service is comparable, but your pricing is so much better than my competition. So at least you have that in your head as you go through, the rest of the questions,
Yeah, and it sets a nice mood for the
No, no,
meeting. It's
absolutely,
positive.
absolutely.
I like that.
So I do have some of the questions because I'm not going to remember all, written right next to me. If you'd like to hear
Fabulous.
some
Why
of
don't we go through some of them? I mean, this is a
them.
channel
Sure.
where people come on to learn things that they can do better. Because honestly, no matter what they're doing, they're dealing with other people. And as you told me in the first interview, your father always said, our customers are people first, customers second, right?
Absolutely right. So
And so
everybody's
in every relationship, this is the truth. These questions are good no matter what you're doing. You could be dealing with internal customers in your company.
internal customers, nonprofits, profits. It doesn't really matter. Uh, it so happens this wasn't one of my questions, but
Hmm.
this attorney that I know who has a great relationship with all his clients, and it's really a personal relationship. He said he always asks his clients, tell me what's on your mind. Okay. Now that does work. It's an amazing question. Okay. If you have already a very solid relationship with that person and you know a lot about them, because he says, these days you don't know what direction they're going to go into. So he asked that question, but I don't think that's necessarily the appropriate question if you don't know the contact that well, because especially if it was the first or second question, they're not going to tell you what's on your mind. It's
No.
like you go into a restaurant and the waiter says, how's everything? And you say fine, or the general manager, it might not be fine. So,
Hmm.
but anyway, but I did want to bring it up that I think it's a great question if you have a very close relationship. What are your goals? How have they changed? How do you measure if your goals have been, achieved? How can we help you meet your goals? What are the top priorities at this time? What are you trying to achieve? As we look at year end, how has your strategic direction changed, and how do you feel your organization is ready to accomplish those new goals? What are your biggest fears? What are the resources can we make available to you? What can I tell you about the market that would be helpful, from our other clients? What provisions should we make to make you feel more comfortable about coming back to whatever our business is, especially if it's a retail or hospitality? By partnering with our firm, what are you specifically hoping to achieve? And what do you like best about interacting with our staff and team? I have like 50 questions. I'm not going to read all 50, but the best way to do this is I'm sure every company has a small staff meeting, whether it's just with their key associates or they have account managers. You should take an hour or 2 hours and just sit in a room and say, if we could ask our customers, our clients, any question, what would those be? And then come up with these 20 or 30, 40 questions. Now, you don't ask 40 or 50 at one time, but if you're going to a specific client, then you say, you know what, these 10 would be appropriate. So let's focus on these 10. And the next time you see them, maybe a year later, you pick out other ones. And so I would have like 50 or 60 questions in your pocket, but you only use 10 or 15 that are appropriate for that client. But
Yeah, what a great way to show you care about them too.
Absolutely.
Asking questions about how they're doing, what are they worried about? How have their plans changed?
Right. And as I said before, and I can't say it enough, everybody has new customers because everybody's position has changed, whether their business or their personal life. And in so many cases, the contact that you are dealing with may not be in the company, or just maybe they even got a promotion, but they're not the decision maker that's going to keep your service or add services to that. So that's why I think it's so important that you start a process. And sales, they always say it's a numbers game, but it's the number of leads and the number of calls, the number of appointments. Retention is the same thing. It's comparable to sales. You have to have a physical, time period. You have to set up a time period when you're going to do this with your clients, and then stick to it. And if you stick to it, it's going to guarantee not only retention, but also increasing market share from those existing customers. and just one other thing related to that, if you have like 3 tiers of customers, maybe your top 20 or 25, you do yourself or your immediate team. If you have a much larger, client base, then maybe you assign the second tier to your account managers, and your third tier, like I was talking to a pension services company that had, like 700 or 800 clients. So what I suggested to them was they take maybe 30 of those 300 or 400 clients and they make personal interviews with those, because that'll probably be representative, but at least they'd be talking to and gaining information from those, that third tier that are not as small, that are small in revenue, but still they make up a big part of their business.
Do you have recommendations in terms of, how often you have these formal meetings to sit down and mix informal stuff with it? Reaching out, calling, how you doing?
I think the formal meeting as a general rule probably shouldn't be more than once a year. And then I'll talk about the informal in a second. And one other thing, never ever call it a survey. My lifestyle is driven by the survey research we do, but these are not surveys. This is a client assessment, a strategic analysis, an industry assessment. Don't ever call it a survey, okay? So, so one of these should probably only be done once a year, okay? And then the exception to that is if you have a new contact, if all of a sudden your client says, I just want to let you know that I got furloughed or laid off and Rosemary is going to take over my job, then you have to make an appointment with Rosemary, okay? Even if you just did it 2 weeks before. Informal, listen, I take my clients out to lunch or breakfast, 2 or 3 times a year. It depends, whether they're, we have clients all over the United States, but if they're in the local area, I definitely take them out to lunch. And I think whether it's virtual now or telephone call, I think you have to be in touch with your clients at least once a quarter, your largest clients for sure.
I got contacted to attend an event, and I thought it was very interesting in that they said, we're going to get food delivered to you. So in place of going to lunch, it was almost like, we're going to find out where you buy from, what you want. We're going to order it and have it delivered to you.
No, I think that I've heard of that, and I think that's cool. And that, logistically, if they're in the area or if they can just do it, I think it's, even if the food isn't perfectly warmer, I think it's the intent. Let's just do this, and we're trying to replicate, the live show.
Try to replicate that 2 to 3 lunch meetings a year, right? Because it's a nice thought that you can get something delivered to them. They're working from home, a lot of these people, and their worlds have changed. So the whole notion of, how do we stay in touch with these clients and, do something a little different maybe to keep the conversation going. I think that's important at this point, right?
No, absolutely. And I know I was on a call the other day with someone who's in the chocolate business, and he said he's getting so many requests, from his clients to send chocolates to specific things. So it's usually you can't go wrong by sending food, to somebody. Everybody seems like food, food is less. I mean, I don't think you can send really flowers to everybody. It might not be appropriate, but food you can, whether it's candy, whether it's cookies, pastries, or, meal, if it's appropriate, I think is a good idea.
With a nice note attached somehow, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, any other recommendations in terms of, managing through tough times or leading through tough times?
I think it's the recommendation I already gave. I think if you see the value in getting customer feedback, schedule a meeting tomorrow, within the next week to meet with your associates and explain, the importance of getting feedback from your customers, and divide that client list up, appropriately, and have people start, making appointments. I mean, don't let a day go by without starting it. I know, listen, I've been in business 32 years and I didn't always have good days. And I remember, when my first client, I had like 2 or 3 clients at the time. Rico was my first client, and I did have them for 18 years, and then their whole business changed, but then we got them back, recently. They still considered they were a client even during this gap. But
Mhm.
I remember going to the mailbox and I saw they never sent me letters before. So all of a sudden I saw this letter and my heart dropped. And the letter said, I'm sorry, our budgets really got cut and we have no choice. And Japanese companies have two fiscal periods a year. So they said, you know what, for the second one, we're gonna, we're sure that we're gonna restart, which they did. But I was so upset, and I was, I was just depressed. But the way I work is the next morning I woke up and said, well, what can I do today to make it a better day? And I just started calling people and doing this and doing that. So don't if you stick your head in the sand, just do it for a few minutes. Wake up the next day, and just start, doing something proactive. And I
Yeah.
think it'll make yourself very successful.
So get their list of questions together right away, and then make sure they've scheduled these conversations with every one of their customers. Split them up. I love
Right.
the question idea. I think it's absolutely great because it does deepen that relationship, show you care.
Absolutely.
So Richard, thanks so much for coming on, buddy. I mean, I think this was really good.
My pleasure.